Karen walked onto the plane, feeling frustrated. She had a long day, and now she just wanted to relax in her first-class seat. But as she made her way down the aisle, something caught her attention. A man, sitting in first class, wore a bright red MAGA hat. Karen's eyebrows pulled together. She let out a small sigh. Seriously, she muttered under her breath. She had always been outspoken about her beliefs. Seeing that hat made her uncomfortable. She assumed the man wearing it must be ignorant or rude. People like him, she thought, didn't deserve to be in first class. She slid into her seat a few rows behind him, but she couldn't stop glancing in his direction. The man seemed calm. He was reading a newspaper, sipping a drink, and minding his own business. But Karen couldn't ignore it. She felt like someone had to say something. The growing frustration. A flight attendant walked past, smiling politely. Karen took the chance to speak up. "Excuse me," she said, waving the attendant over. "I don't think that hat should be allowed on this flight." The flight attendant looked confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Which hat?" Karen pointed at the man. "That one. It's offensive. People shouldn't be allowed to wear things like that in public places." The flight attendant hesitated. "Well, ma'am, passengers are allowed to wear whatever they choose as long as it follows airline rules." Karen's frustration grew. "So, you're saying anyone can wear anything, even if it makes people uncomfortable?" The flight attendant kept her polite smile. "Unless it breaks a rule or policy, we don't ask passengers to remove their clothing, ma'am." Karen huffed and crossed her arms. The MAGA hat man still hadn't said a word. He continued reading his newspaper as if he didn't hear the conversation. The first signs of trouble. Karen wasn't used to being ignored. She leaned forward in her seat, raising her voice just a little. "Excuse me, sir," she said. The man slowly looked up from his newspaper. His face was calm, his eyes kind but unreadable. "Yes?" he asked in a polite tone. Karen gestured toward his hat. "Do you really think that's appropriate to wear here?" The man took a sip of his drink before answering. "Why wouldn't it be?" His voice was steady, not defensive. Karen scoffed. "Well, it's offensive. People might feel uncomfortable." The man tilted his head. "I see." He didn't say anything more. Karen expected him to argue back. Instead, he went back to reading, as if the conversation never happened. This made Karen even more irritated. She wasn't about to let this go. She turned back to the flight attendant. "I want to speak to the pilot. If he won't take that hat off, then I don't want to be on this flight." The flight attendant hesitated. Passengers nearby started whispering, sensing the tension. The real confrontation was just beginning. Karen was not someone who easily gave up. Her heart was racing with frustration as she stood up from her seat and walked down the aisle. She had already asked the flight attendant, but now she was determined to speak to the captain directly. As she made her way to the front of the plane, she kept glancing at the man in the MAGA hat, still seated, still calm. His lack of reaction made her even more irritated. How could he not care about the fact that his hat was making people uncomfortable? She finally reached the front of the plane, where the flight attendants were standing, and she spoke up. "I need to speak to the captain." "This is ridiculous," she said in a sharp tone. One of the attendants, a young woman, tried to calm her down. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset. We're doing our best to keep things peaceful, but I can assure you, the captain is busy." "No," Karen snapped. "This needs to be handled. I won't sit here while people like him get away with wearing that kind of thing." She pointed to the man in the seat ahead. The flight attendant glanced in his direction, but she stayed professional. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there is nothing wrong with what he's wearing," the flight attendant explained. Karen's voice rose as she continued. "Well, I find it offensive. It's not just me. A lot of people here probably feel the same way." The other passengers had started to notice the argument, but most of them stayed quiet. Some looked over at Karen and then at the man, not wanting to get involved. "I don't want to be on a flight with him wearing that hat," Karen insisted, her voice firm. The flight attendant, trying to stay calm, said, "Ma'am, please take your seat. I'll speak to the captain when I can, but there is no policy about what passengers wear." Karen couldn't believe it. She couldn't understand how this was happening. Why wasn't anyone taking her side? She turned back toward the man in the hat, who was now looking out of the window, completely ignoring her. His calmness was starting to bother her even more. How dare he be so relaxed when she was clearly upset? Karen's patience had run out. She walked right up to the man's seat, leaned over, and said, "Do you even understand why that hat is offensive?" The man looked up at her, his expression still calm and unbothered. "I understand you don't like it," he said softly. "I don't just not like it," Karen exclaimed. "It's disrespectful to everyone here. It's wrong." The man simply nodded, never raising his voice. He looked at Karen for a moment, as if considering her words. Then he spoke quietly. "If you don't like it, you can always leave," he said. Karen felt her face flush with embarrassment. How could he speak to her like that? Was he challenging her? She could feel her anger bubbling up again. She had to do something. Karen's heart was pounding in her chest. The nerve of this man. How could he be so calm and dismissive? She couldn't let him get away with this. No one could. Her hands were shaking as she backed away from the man's seat, feeling a strange mix of anger and embarrassment. She looked around, expecting someone else to speak up, to support her. But everyone else was quiet, their eyes either glued to their own screens or looking out of the windows. It was as if they didn't want to get involved. She turned back to the flight attendant, her voice firm now. "This is not right. I'm telling you. This man is causing trouble. You have to do something." The flight attendant's expression was neutral. She had seen this type of situation before. She was trained to handle it, to calm things down. But Karen's refusal to stop made her feel a little helpless. "Ma'am," she said again, "I'll speak with the captain. But as I told you, there's no rule against hats like his. There's nothing more I can do." Karen could feel the frustration building. She could see the other passengers starting to whisper to one another, wondering what was going on. But it didn't matter. She was determined to make this man understand that his behavior was wrong. She walked over to his seat once more, but this time she didn't just stand there. She leaned in, speaking more forcefully. "You're not getting away with this." The man looked up at her again, his eyes still calm. He put his newspaper down and folded it neatly. His posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said quietly. "But you're making this much bigger than it needs to be." Karen could feel her hands balling into fists. "You're the one making it a problem. You don't even care that people are upset by that hat." The man took a deep breath, as if he was gathering his thoughts. He didn't raise his voice or argue. Instead, he simply said, "I don't mean to upset you, but I'm just wearing a hat. It's not that big of a deal." But to Karen, it was a huge deal. How could anyone be so unaware of the impact their actions could have on others? She could feel the anger bubbling inside her. The tension between them was thick now. The other passengers were starting to notice the conversation was not just a small disagreement. People were starting to shift in their seats, glancing over at the two of them. Some seemed to be watching in silence, others unsure whether they should step in. But Karen didn't care. She had a point to prove, and she wasn't about to back down. She stepped back from the man's seat again, her mind racing. Her frustration was building to the point where she couldn't think straight. Why wasn't he listening? Why wasn't anyone helping her? Her voice rose again. "I want you to take that hat off," she said, her words sharp. The man sighed, but his expression never changed. He just nodded slowly. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll take it off if that's what you want. But it's not going to fix anything." Karen froze. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Was he really just going to give in? Was this over? But she hadn't expected what came next. Karen's breath was heavy, her frustration reaching a boiling point. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The man in the MAGA hat had agreed to take it off, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like he was mocking her. She turned to the flight attendant, who was still standing nearby, trying to stay neutral. Karen could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Everyone was watching. "I want to speak to the captain now," Karen said, her voice tight. "This needs to be handled properly." The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, looking at the captain, who was at the front of the plane in the cockpit. She knew Karen wasn't going to stop until she had her way. But she also knew the captain was busy preparing for the flight ahead. "I'll see if he can come out, ma'am," the attendant replied, her tone respectful but firm. Karen crossed her arms and waited, her eyes locked on the man in the MAGA hat. He was still calm, still so unbothered by the scene unfolding around him. It only made Karen angrier. She couldn't understand how someone could be so indifferent when she was trying to make a point. A few minutes later, the captain finally emerged from the cockpit, a calm but authoritative figure. The moment he stepped into the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. He was a professional, a man in charge, used to handling difficult situations. "Ma'am, I understand there's an issue," the captain said, addressing Karen first. His voice was low and steady, but it carried an undeniable weight. "Yes," Karen exclaimed, feeling a sense of relief. "This man is causing a problem with his hat. He's making people uncomfortable, and it's unacceptable." She looked toward the man with the MAGA hat. "He needs to be removed from this flight." The captain glanced at the man, who was now sitting back in his seat, still calm and quiet. The captain didn't rush to judgment. He took a moment, as if carefully considering what Karen had said. "Ma'am," the captain said gently, "I understand you're upset, but there are no rules against wearing hats on our flights, as long as it doesn't disrupt safety or cause harm to others. Passengers are free to wear what they choose." Karen shook her head, her face flushed with frustration. "But this hat is offensive. I'm not the only one who thinks so. There are other people here who are uncomfortable too." The captain took another moment to look around at the other passengers. Some were quietly reading. Some were still watching the scene unfold. Most seemed to be waiting for the situation to calm down. "Ma'am, I've spoken with the flight attendants, and everyone has had the opportunity to voice their concerns," the captain continued. "If this continues, I'm afraid we will have to ask you to leave the flight." Karen's eyes widened in shock. "What? You're going to ask me to leave? I'm the one who's being disrespected here." The captain remained calm, unshaken by Karen's outburst. "I'm just asking you to be reasonable, ma'am. This situation is getting out of hand, and it's affecting everyone's comfort." For the first time, Karen felt doubt creeping in. She didn't want to lose her chance at this flight, but she wasn't ready to back down. The tension in the air was thick as the captain waited for her response. The words the captain had just spoken hit Karen like a cold wave. She had never expected the situation to spiral like this. The fact that the captain was suggesting she leave the plane was a shock. It felt like everything she had tried to do, every word she had said, was leading her nowhere. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. The captain was serious. He wasn't going to let her continue causing a scene. He was in charge, and Karen didn't know how to respond. I can't just leave," Karen stammered, looking at the man in the MAGA hat. He was still sitting there, his expression calm, as though nothing had happened. That annoyed her even more. How could he be so unaffected by everything? The captain didn't respond right away. He simply waited, giving her a moment to process his words. After a few seconds, he spoke again. "Ma'am, I suggest you calm down. We're all just trying to have a safe and comfortable flight. Let's move past this, all right?" Karen felt her face redden. She wasn't used to being told to calm down, especially not by a stranger. But she still wasn't ready to give in. This wasn't just about the hat anymore. It was about standing up for what she believed in. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and turned toward the man in the seat again. "You don't care, do you?" Karen said, her voice quieter now, but still sharp. "You really don't care that your hat is making everyone uncomfortable? Don't you care how this makes people feel?" The man finally looked up at her. For the first time, he didn't seem as calm. But instead of getting angry, he just looked tired. "Look," he said, his voice still gentle, "I didn't come here to upset anyone. I'm just wearing a hat." He paused, setting down his drink and looking at her. "But you don't seem to understand. I can't change who I am for the sake of anyone else's comfort." Karen blinked. The words hit harder than she expected. She hadn't expected him to speak like this. Was he really saying that he wouldn't change something so small just to make everyone else feel better? Before Karen could respond, the man stood up. He didn't raise his voice or make any dramatic movements. He simply took off his MAGA hat and placed it on his seat. "I'll take it off," he said calmly, "but it doesn't change anything. The truth is, it's just a hat. We all have our opinions. We have our differences, and that's okay." For a moment, Karen didn't know how to respond. She had wanted him to back down. But now, instead of backing down, he was simply offering a small gesture. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a defeat either. It was just a moment of realization. The man looked at her one last time before sitting back down. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. Karen stood frozen for a few moments. Was this really happening? Was it really as simple as that? Her frustration was still there, but now there was something else too. A feeling she couldn't quite place. Doubt. She turned to the captain, who was still watching her quietly. Karen stood there, still feeling the weight of the man's words, but there was a strange shift in the air now. The man had taken off his hat, as if to show he could compromise, but she wasn't sure if that was enough to make her feel better. Her mind raced, still tangled in frustration. The flight attendant, who had been standing off to the side, glanced at Karen and then at the man, as if trying to figure out if things had calmed down. She hesitated for a moment, before walking over to the captain. Karen looked down at the floor for a moment, collecting her thoughts. She wasn't sure what to do now. The man had removed his hat, yet it still felt like there was a deeper issue she couldn't get past. Her eyes moved back toward him. He was sitting quietly, his posture relaxed, almost as though he hadn't just been at the center of an argument. He didn't seem angry. He didn't seem upset. In fact, he looked completely unfazed. The man took a deep breath and glanced up at her, his calm eyes meeting hers once again. "Look, I understand you're upset, but I've been through this before," he said quietly. "I'm not trying to make anyone uncomfortable. I just want to get through this flight like everyone else." Karen felt a pang of guilt hit her chest. This wasn't the confrontation she had imagined. It wasn't as dramatic as she had thought it would be. He was calm, even patient, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized he wasn't the one who had escalated things. It was her. She had let her emotions take over, pushing this simple situation further than it needed to go. Before she could say anything, the flight attendant returned, this time walking beside the captain. The captain, now looking at Karen with a steady gaze, spoke first. "Ma'am," the captain said softly, "I think it's time we clear up any misunderstandings. This man you've been arguing with, the one you assumed was causing all the trouble." He paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "He's not just another passenger." Karen looked at him, confused. She had been so focused on the disagreement that she hadn't thought to ask who this man really was. The flight attendant stepped forward, nodding slowly. "Actually," the captain continued, "he's the owner of this airline. He owns the entire company." Karen froze. She blinked a few times, trying to process what she was hearing. Her mind raced. This couldn't be true. There was no way. "What?" Karen whispered, barely able to believe her own words. She turned slowly to the man in the seat. His calm expression had not changed at all. If anything, It was as if he expected her to be shocked. "I own this airline," the man said simply, nodding as he spoke. "I've been working in this industry for years. This flight, these planes, everything you see, it's mine. But I don't usually like to draw attention to that." The shock hit Karen like a wave. She didn't know what to say. Her thoughts scrambled. Here she was, arguing with the owner of the very airline she was flying on, all over a hat. The reality of the situation was hard to grasp. For a long moment, Karen said nothing. The man simply sat there, his hands resting on his lap, waiting for her to process this revelation. The captain and flight attendant waited patiently too, as if giving Karen the space she needed. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice quieter now, almost embarrassed. I didn't know," she admitted, her face turning slightly red. "I didn't realize who you were." The man gave her a small, understanding smile. "Most people don't," he replied. "And that's okay. But sometimes it's important to take a step back and think before we act. Everyone deserves respect, no matter what." Karen nodded, feeling a little ashamed of her earlier actions. She had assumed things about him based solely on his appearance and what he was wearing. She hadn't stopped to think about who he might be as a person. "I'm sorry," Karen said softly, her voice sincere. "I didn't mean to cause so much trouble." The man smiled again, this time more warmly. "It's okay. We all make mistakes." Karen stood there, still processing everything that had just been revealed to her. She had never imagined that the man she had been arguing with was the owner of the very airline she was flying with. The shock of it all left her speechless for a moment. The flight attendant and the captain exchanged glances, and the tension in the air started to clear. The man in the MAGA hat, the one who she had been so quick to judge, sat quietly, waiting for her to say something. Karen could feel her face turning red with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out right away. Her thoughts were still tangled. She had made a mistake, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. The captain gave her a small nod, his expression calm but serious. "Ma'am, I think this situation can be resolved now. But I want to remind you that we're all here to have a safe and comfortable flight. We can't allow behavior like this to disrupt things. I hope you understand." Karen swallowed hard. She did understand, more than she wanted to admit. She had let her emotions take over, and in doing so, she had caused more trouble than she ever intended. This wasn't just about a hat. It was about judging others without really understanding them. And now she was facing the consequences of that. The man, still sitting in his seat, spoke up again. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of finality in his words. "I'm not upset with you, but I do think this could have been handled differently. I understand that you felt uncomfortable, but there's no need to cause such a scene. We all have our differences, but we have to respect each other." Karen nodded, her throat tight. She had heard his words, but now it felt like a weight was on her chest. She had been wrong, and no matter how hard she tried to explain herself, the truth was clear. She had judged him based on his appearance, without considering who he really was. The flight attendant stepped forward again, her tone polite but firm. "Karen, we just want everyone to enjoy the flight. We've all tried to stay calm, but it's important to understand that what happens on this plane affects everyone. You need to respect that." Karen felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had wanted to stand her ground, to fight for what she believed was right, but now she saw the bigger picture. She had let her emotions cloud her judgment, and in doing so, she had disrespected not only the man but also the other passengers who had witnessed the whole thing. The captain spoke once more, his voice softer now. "We'll allow you to continue on this flight, but I do want you to think about what just happened. It's important that we respect each other, no matter our differences. I trust that this won't happen again." Karen nodded silently, her eyes focused on the floor. She couldn't look at the man in the MAGA hat anymore. She felt a mixture of shame and relief, knowing that she hadn't been kicked off the flight, but also realizing how much she had learned in such a short amount of time. After a moment of quiet reflection, she finally spoke. "I'm sorry for everything," she said, her voice sincere. "I really didn't mean to cause so much trouble. I was wrong." The man gave her a small smile, his expression softening. "Apology accepted. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." As Karen returned to her seat, she couldn't help but feel a little lighter. She had made a huge mistake, but it wasn't too late to make things right. This would be a lesson she would carry with her, a reminder to think before acting, especially when it came to judging others. Karen sat quietly in her seat, her mind still swirling with the events that had unfolded. She couldn't believe how quickly everything had gotten out of hand. The moment she had stepped onto this flight, she had never imagined that she would end up confronting the owner of the airline, or that she would learn such an important lesson about judging others. As the plane continued its journey, the tension in the cabin began to ease. The captain had made it clear that the situation was over, and everyone seemed to relax a bit. Passengers who had been watching the confrontation now returned to their books, phones, or in-flight entertainment. But for Karen, the quiet wasn't enough to wash away the feeling of guilt that still lingered. The man in the MAGA hat, the owner of the airline, had gone back to reading his newspaper as if nothing had happened. He was calm, unbothered by the scene they had just been through. Karen couldn't help but admire that. How could he remain so composed after everything she had said to him? A part of her wanted to go up to him again, to apologize once more, but another part of her felt like she should just leave him alone. She had already done enough. And now, as the flight continued, she had a lot of time to think. She didn't want to make the same mistake again. Eventually, the flight attendants began to serve refreshments, walking down the aisles with trays of drinks and snacks. Karen accepted a glass of water, but she barely tasted it. Her mind was still on the conversation she had with the man earlier, and on the words he had said. "We all have our differences, but we have to respect each other." The captain's voice came over the loudspeaker, signaling that they were getting close to their destination. "We'll be landing in about 30 minutes, folks. Please make sure your seatbelt is fastened and your tray tables are up. Thank you for choosing our airline." Karen glanced out the window, watching as the clouds started to break apart, revealing the city below. The flight had been long, but it had also been eye-opening. She realized that this experience had changed her in a way she hadn't expected. She had come on this flight with one mindset, but she was leaving it with something completely different. She knew she would never forget the lesson she had learned, that it's easy to jump to conclusions, but much harder to really understand someone before making judgments. And most importantly, it was essential to respect others, even when they didn't share her views. As the plane began its descent, Karen took a deep breath and glanced at the man in the MAGA hat once more. He had taken the time to explain himself without raising his voice, without turning the situation into a shouting match. He had been calm and patient. Maybe she could learn from that too. Maybe patience and calm were the answers to so many problems. And next time, if she found herself in a similar situation, she would approach it differently. The captain made his final announcement as the wheels touched the ground. "We've landed. Please remain seated until the plane has come to a complete stop." Karen unbuckled her seatbelt, feeling a strange mix of relief and gratitude. She had learned something important, something she could take with her. And in a way, that was better than anything she could have expected when she first boarded the flight. As she left the plane, she took one last look at the MAGA hat man, who was standing up now, ready to exit. He caught her eye and gave her a small, understanding smile. Karen returned the smile, silently thanking him for being the person who had shown her that respect and understanding were far more important than anything else. As Karen walked through the airport terminal, she felt a sense of quiet reflection settle over her. The events of the flight kept replaying in her mind, but now, instead of anger or frustration, she felt a strange mix of understanding and humility. The lesson she had learned wasn't something she had expected, but it was one she would carry with her for a long time. As she made her way to the baggage claim area, she couldn't help but think about the man in the MAGA hat. She had never imagined that she would be standing up for what she believed in, and then realize how wrong her actions had been. How quickly she had judged him, based only on a hat and her assumptions. She knew now that there was so much more to people than what they wore or what they looked like. The whole situation had started so small, over something as simple as a piece of clothing. But it had grown into something much bigger. It had made Karen realize how often she had let her emotions and judgments cloud her ability to really see people for who they were. She had learned the importance of respecting others, no matter what their opinions were, no matter what they believed. Every person had their own story, their own perspective, and it wasn't fair to make assumptions about them based on one small detail. As she picked up her luggage and started walking toward the exit, she felt more aware of the people around her. The man in the hat hadn't just taught her a lesson. He had shown her that sometimes the best way to handle a situation was with calm and patience. In the end, that was something she wanted to practice more in her own life. Karen's phone buzzed, and she pulled it out to see a message from a friend asking how the flight went. She paused for a moment before typing her response. It was a lot more than just a flight. It was a lesson. She hit send, then smiled to herself. Maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter for her. A chapter where she listened more and judged less. A chapter where she saw people for who they really were, not just for their opinions or appearances. And for the first time in a long while, Karen felt proud of herself, not because she was perfect, but because she had learned something important, something that would make her a better person moving forward. As she walked out into the bright sunlight of the airport, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She would be more careful with her judgments, and she would always remember the man in the MAGA hat who had taught her such a valuable lesson.